Michael Sandel has a method, and the method is this. Take the moral discomfort you already feel, dress it in the vocabulary of political philosophy, and hand it back to you as an argument. The feeling arrives first. The argument never quite follows. What looks like excavation is, on inspection, a very elegant form of staying put. Sandel is a political philosopher at Harvard, best known for a course on justice that became one of the university's most attended lectures, and for a sequence of books, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, What Money Can't Buy. That positioned him as the foremost English-language critic of market liberalism and the liberal theory of the self that underwrites it. He emerged from the communitarian debates of the 1980s, launched a serious early critique of Rawls, and has spent the subsequent decades translating that critique into public philosophy. He is, by any measure, a significant figure in the intellectual landscape. What Sandel actually does is conduct a kind of sustained phenomenological audit of modern life. He identifies domains where market logic feels wrong, paid line standards, corporate life insurance policies, children paid to read books, and argues that the feeling of wrongness is philosophically serious. Markets, when introduced into certain spheres, do not merely change prices but corrupt meanings, crowding out the non-market norms that made those goods valuable in the first place. Alongside this runs a critique of liberal political theory, the Rawlsian unencumbered self, capable of choosing its ends from behind a veil of ignorance, is, Sandel argues, a fiction. Real selves are constitutively embedded in communities, traditions, and loyalties they did not choose. Any adequate politics must reckon with that thickness. The pitch is coherent. The execution is something else. The deepest problem with Sandel is not that he is wrong about his conclusions. It is that his conclusions are doing all the work his arguments were supposed to do, and the architecture in between is held up almost entirely by metaphor and theatrical timing. Take the market's argument first. His signature concept, crowding out, sounds mechanistic. It pictures two things competing for the same space. The price signal enters, the intrinsic norm exits. The hydraulic image is vivid enough that you feel you have been given an explanation. You have been given a picture. Actual question: under what conditions does commodification alter the norms attached to a good? At what rate, reversibly or not, for whom, through which institutional mechanisms, is precisely the question the metaphor forecloses rather than opens. When Sandel illustrates this with a child paid to read, he takes a dyadic exchange with a specific motivational profile, and silently promotes it to a general claim about market logic at the level of civil. The intermediate layer, institutions, regulatory regimes, professional cultures, competing counterpressures, the concrete mechanisms by which a logic actually spreads or gets blocked, simply disappears. His markets are made of ideas about markets. Actual markets are made of contracts, property law, credit instruments, and enforcement regimes. The collision between them produces phenomena you cannot read off from the philosophical properties of either concept. The inverse failure is equally systematic. The civic sphere Sandel wants to protect, the commons, the republican tradition, civic friendship, is presented as something naturally self-sustaining, corrupted only by the introduction of price signals from outside. But civic life is not a pre-existing condition that markets interrupt. It is a precarious emergent property of specific historical configurations, sustained by concrete institutions, produced through conflict, labor, and contingent political settlements that are themselves shot through with power asymmetries and structured exclusions. Sandel's commons is nostalgia wearing the clothing of ontology. The result is a critique that cannot say anything precise about where market logic can be stopped, how, by whom, and under what conditions. His practical recommendations dissolve into the exhortation to hold better public deliberations about which goods belong in which spheres, as though the problem were primarily one of insufficient philosophical clarity rather than of structural power operating through concrete mechanisms and at multiple scales simultaneously. The self and community argument is no more securely built. The phenomenology of belonging, the felt sense that our loyalties are constitutive rather than merely chosen, is made to do double duty. It explains why liberal neutrality misfires, and it grounds the normative priority of community over individual choice. Neither inference survives pressure. The felt weight of communal membership is a datum that requires explanation. The social psychology of group identity, its plasticity, its post hoc constructions, its dependence on boundary drawing and exclusion. Sandel cannot engage with any of this because engaging with it would reduce the phenomenological sense of embeddedness to something to be explained, rather than something that explains. The foundation has to be foundational. More damaging still, Sandel has no method for determining which communities, which traditions, which shared understandings carry normative weight. The community is treated as a cohesive entity with discoverable moral contents, when in practice any actual community is internally fractured, its shared understandings simultaneously claimed by incompatible factions, its apparent consensus the product of power, historical accident, and selective memory. When Sandel appeals to communal values against liberal neutrality, he is not consulting the community, he is performing a selective reading and presenting it as discovery. And then there is the Rawls problem, which is frankly embarrassing at this point. Sandel's critique of the unencumbered self in liberalism and the limits of justice had genuine force against a certain Kantian metaphysics of the person. Rawls answered it by dropping the metaphysical claims entirely, pivoting to a purely political conception of the self in political liberalism. That was 1993. Sandel did not substantially revise. He has been lecturing from a refuted position for 3 decades, as though the reply never arrived. Underneath all of this is a methodological commitment that is never stated openly but is operative everywhere. That phenomenological reflection gives access to truths about selfhood and political community that empirical inquiry cannot reach or constrain. When psychology, sociology, or cultural evolution deliver findings that complicate the picture, those findings are simply not in the conversation. The lecture hall is a sealed chamber where moral intuitions circulate without friction, each one confirmed rather than tested, elevated rather than interrogated. What looks like rigor is the performance of rigor. What looks like depth is the sensation of descent. The questions are important. The progressive colonization of social life by a single logic of valuation is worth taking seriously. The impoverishment of public discourse by the evacuation of moral substance is not imaginary. The liberal tradition's tendency to treat the self as prior to its ends does introduce distortions into political theory that matter for practice. And Sandel is correct that moral intuitions are not mere feelings to be overridden by efficiency calculations, they encode something, even if he cannot tell you what. His early critique of Rawls identified a genuine gap in the metaphysical foundations of high liberal theory, a gap that forced Rawls to do important work. That is not nothing. He is also, for what it is worth, a genuinely skilled teacher of a certain kind of intellectual discomfort. The Socratic staging of his lectures creates conditions in which students discover that their moral intuitions are in tension with one another. That discovery is real, even if everything Sandel subsequently does with it is questionable. Sandel has built a career on giving people the experience of moral clarity, without the cost of serious analysis. He takes the discomfort you already feel, confirms that it is philosophically serious and leaves you exactly where you started, except now you have a vocabulary for it. The lectures end. You feel you have understood something. You have been given a very beautiful map of a territory that does not exist. He is not a rigorous theorist of what our moral unease means or what we should do about it. He is an extraordinarily effective validator of it. Those are different jobs. Conflating them has been, for him, professionally advantageous and philosophically disastrous. If any of this landed wrong, go read Sandel yourself. Justice is a reasonable place to start, and figure out where the argument actually holds. That's the only move worth making.